Hey guys, tonight, the story of a woman you have already met. You met her once, for about 4 minutes, on the warmest page of the gentlest book ever written about an American childhood. You know her as Aunt Eliza. In Little House in the Big Woods, she comes through the snow at Christmas with her husband and her children, and for one chapter the cold little cabin fills up with cousins and candle smoke and the smell of someone else's cooking. A small girl named Laura is happier than she has the words for. Aunt Eliza laughs. Aunt Eliza helps Ma in the kitchen. She is warm and round and kind, and then the chapter ends, and she walks back out into the snow, and the book never really follows her again. That is the whole of her, as far as most people will ever know. One Christmas, one warm room, a name a child loved. Here is what that chapter does not tell you. The woman at that table had already lost her father to Lake Michigan. In the spring of 1862, her brother Joseph was wounded at Shiloh, the bloodiest battle the United States had yet seen. And in the family history record used here, her first child, Alice Josephine, the prettiest baby she ever saw, as Eliza later wrote in her own hand, is placed in the same terrible April as Joseph's death. One date. A birth and a death. Read that again. The timing is not a thing the books wanted you holding. The book gave you Christmas. The rest stayed outside the frame. So, before we go any further, if you find these stories worth your time, the slow ones, the true ones, the ones nobody else is sitting with at this hour, do me a quiet favour and subscribe. It is the one thing that keeps a calm voice, finding the people who need it tonight. That's all. Now turn the lights down. Settle in. We're going back to Wisconsin, to a family the books quietly turned into furniture, and to the sister they only let you see for one chapter. Her name was Eliza Ann Quiner. And to understand why that single Christmas was such a careful piece of editing, you have to start where she started, not in the big woods. Before that, on the water. Start with a fact, because the fact is where the trouble begins. Eliza Ann Quiner was born on the 21st of April, 1842, in Wisconsin, the sixth of 7 children born to Henry and Charlotte Quiner. She was the little one. By the time she was old enough to remember anything at all, the most important thing about her family had already happened, and it had happened to a man she would never get to know. Her father was a trader. Henry Newcomb Quiner moved goods along the edge of the frontier, dealing with settlers and with the native people of the western Great Lakes, carrying what he had over land when he could and over water when he had to. Water was the fastest mode of transportation in that country. Water was also the one that did not forgive mistakes. In November 1845, though some older family summaries place the loss more loosely around 1844-45, Henry Quiner went out onto Lake Michigan aboard a schooner named the Ocean. He was off the Michigan shore near Street Joseph when an autumn gale overtook the vessel. The Ocean was later found abandoned, and Henry Quiner did not come home. He was 37 years old. Caroline, the sister you know as Ma, was 5. Eliza was 3, barely old enough to carry any clear memory of him. Stop on that for a second, because the books never will. 2 of the women who would one day be folded into the Little House story as gentle background, Ma in the rocking chair, Aunt Eliza at the Christmas table, began their lives as children of a drowned man. They did not lose their father to old age, in a bed, with time to say goodbye. They lost him to a storm on open water, with no body to bury and no grave to visit. One week, he was a trader away on a trip, the way he had been 100 times. The next week he was a thing that had happened to the lake. A widow named Charlotte was left in a half-built corner of Wisconsin, with a house full of children and a dead husband at the bottom of an inland sea. Now, what does that do to a family? It does the thing the books are least interested in. It makes them poor. Not poor like a hard winter. Poverty is a structural fact. Charlotte Quiner had no husband, no income, and in the 1840s, in Wisconsin, as a woman almost no legal way to make the second 2 things appear out of the first one being gone. There was no system underneath her. There was no one coming. There were just the children, the work, and the arithmetic that never quite closed. The older boys went to work as soon as they could be of any use. The girls learned early what frontier girls learned, that a household runs on female labour no one writes down, and that grief is a luxury you take in the few minutes between chores. Caroline learnt it. Eliza learned it younger, because she was younger, and because by the time her memory switched on, the lesson was simply the shape of the world. There was no before. There was no version of the Quiner children's life with a father in it that Eliza could actually remember. There was only the after, and the after was the only weather she knew. This is the first thing the Christmas chapter hides, and it hides it by simply starting later. By the time Laura meets Aunt Eliza, Eliza is a grown woman in a warm room, and a child has no reason to ask what a grown-up's face is carrying. Children take adults at face value. That is their gift and their blindness. Laura wrote the aunt. She saw a kind, round woman at a holiday, because that is the aunt a happy 6-year-old would see. But we are not 6, and the record does not have the luxury of a child's eyes. Here is what the record holds instead. In 1849, about 4 years after the drowning, Charlotte Quiner married again. His name was Frederick Holbrook, and he was a farmer, and the marriage did the practical thing a second marriage did in that time and place. It put a man's labour and a man's legal standing back under a household that had been running without either. The family moved to a farm in Concord, in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. There was, at last, ground under their feet that someone in the house could legally hold. And there was a new child, a half-sister. Charlotte, they called her Lottie. So the 7 Quiner children of a drowned trader became, by arithmetic, part of a blended frontier household. The older ones half raised on loss, the younger ones folded into a second family with a stepfather's name on the deed. That is the soil Eliza grew up in, not the cozy big woods. A patched-together farm in Jefferson County, built on top of a grief nobody had time to finish. And it matters more than almost anything else in this whole story because of who lived to the south of that farm. To the south, on 80 acres bought in 1854, lived another family that had moved around too much and not quite landed. A man named Lansford Ingalls, his wife Laura, and their long row of children. 10 of them, give or take the one buried in infancy. And among those Ingalls children were 3 who are about to walk straight into the Quiner girls' lives and never walk back out. A son named Charles, a son named Peter, a daughter named Polly. 2 families, side by side, in the same hard corner of Wisconsin. One built on a drowning, one built on a father who could never seem to hold a piece of land for long. Neither of them the warm, settled, self-reliant pioneer households of the television show or the picture books. They were, both of them, families that the frontier had already been working on for a while, and they were about to braid themselves together so tightly that, 2 generations later, a writer would have to spend real effort pulling the knots apart and hiding the loose ends. That braiding starts with a wedding. Actually, it starts with 3 of them. But the record asks for patience here, so give it patience. Because before the weddings, you need to understand what these 2 broken families actually were to each other. And you need to meet the brother. The one that the title of tonight's story is quietly about. The one whose death is sitting at the far end of this, like a stone you can already feel under the water. His name was Joseph. Keep him in mind. We are not done with the lake, and we have not yet gotten to the war, but both of them are already in the room. The picture you carry of pioneer families is probably a clean one. A father with a steady eye, a mother in an apron. A claim that holds. Children who grow straight up out of good ground, like corn. The record does not give you that picture. The record gives you 2 households in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in the 1850s, both of them already worn thin, and it puts them within walking distance of each other. To the north, the Quiners. A drowned father, a remarried mother, a stepfather's name on the deed, and a line of children who had learned to work before they learned to grieve. To the south, the Ingallses. Lansford and Laura Ingalls and their 10 children, fresh off yet another move New York, then Illinois, then Wisconsin, a family that kept arriving somewhere new and calling it the place that would finally work. Lansford Ingalls was a restless man with a restless man's relationship to land. He bought 80 acres in Concord in 1854. Hold on to that, because the way he eventually lost it is going to tell you something about the world Eliza was marrying into. 2 families, both moving, both are short on money, Both have more children than ground. And the children, naturally, did what children who live near each other do. They grew up alongside one another. They worked the same seasons, walked the same roads, stood up at the same dances, and sat in the same churches. The Quiner girls and the Ingalls boys were not strangers who met cute. They were neighbours who had known each other's faces for years, in the specific way frontier neighbours did, which is to say completely, with no privacy and no illusions. Now meet the man the show never mentions. Meet Joseph. Joseph Quiner was Charlotte's eldest surviving son, the eldest son of the drowned trader. When your father goes down on a schooner, and your mother is left with a house full of children, the oldest boy is not really allowed to be a boy for very long. He becomes, whether anyone says it out loud or not, a kind of load-bearing wall. Joseph was that. By the mid-1850s, he was a grown man, married, living a few miles off, doing the thing the oldest son of a dead man does, being steady, being there, being the one the younger ones could measure themselves against. Eliza grew up under that, a father she never knew, and an older brother who quietly stood in the gap the father left. That is the family she came out of. Not soft, not cosy. Tested already, and holding. And then, across 3 years, the two worn families stitched themselves together. Not once, 3 times. Watch the order, because it matters. In 1859, Henry Quiner, one of Eliza's brothers, married Polly Ingalls, one of the Ingalls daughters, a Quiner boy and an Ingalls girl, the first thread. In 1860, on the 1st of February, Charles Ingalls married Caroline Quiner. Pa married Ma. The thread you already know, the one every Little House story is hung on. But notice, it was the second of these weddings, not the first. The marriage the whole world remembers was, at the time, just the middle one of 3 between 2 ordinary neighbouring families. And then, on the 5th of June, 1861 the third, Peter Ingalls, Charles's older brother, the eldest of all the Ingalls children, married Eliza Ann Quiner, Caroline's little sister. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is genuinely strange, and the book works hard to keep you from noticing how strange. A brother and a sister from one family married a sister, and a brother from the other. Charles Ingalls and his brother Peter married Caroline Quiner and her sister Eliza. 2 Ingalls men, 2 Quiner women, in 2 households that were now doubly bound brothers-in-law twice over. Sisters who were also each other's sisters-in-law. The children those 2 couples would have were not ordinary cousins. They were double cousins, sharing not one set of common relatives but 2, carrying twice the shared blood that the word cousin normally implies. This is the part the cosy Christmas chapter floats right over. When Laura writes that Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter came for the holiday with their children, she is describing, in the warmest possible terms, a knot of intermarriage between 2 families that had bound themselves together about as tightly as 2 families can without anyone raising an eyebrow in church. It was not scandalous. It was not secret. It was simply close frontier close, the closeness of people with few options and fewer neighbours who married the family next door because the family next door was who there was. So, when Eliza married Peter in June of 1861, she was not marrying a stranger. She was marrying her sister's husband's brother. She was tightening a knot her sister had already started tying. She was becoming, in the same motion, a wife and a double sister-in-law, and the second Quiner girl to disappear into the Ingalls family. And here is where the world they were marrying into shows its real face. That same year, January of 1861, just months before Peter and Eliza stood up together, Lansford Ingalls lost his farm, the 80 acres in Concord, gone, sold out from under the family at a sheriff's auction. A sheriff's auction is not a quiet thing. It is the public, legal, humiliating end of a man's claim to a piece of ground, the county stepping in because the debts have outrun the dirt, and selling the land on the courthouse steps to whoever will cover what is owed. Lansford Ingalls, the patriarch, the father of the man who would become Pa, had his land taken and sold because he could not hold it. So picture the actual June wedding. Eliza Quiner, daughter of a drowned trader, raised poor, marries Peter Ingalls, son of a man who has just had his farm auctioned out from under him for debt. Two children of instability, joining two families of instability, in a corner of Wisconsin where neither set of parents had managed to plant anything that stayed planted. There is no fortune here. There is no homestead waiting. There is a young couple with nothing much but each other and a very large extended family that is frankly also broke. That is the marriage. The Christmas chapter turns into a warm, round aunt with a house full of laughing cousins. Now I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and cheap to make this sound like a tragedy from the first day, and it was not. People marry poor and build lives. People love each other across hard ground. Eliza and Peter were not doomed. They were ordinary, in the way that most real frontier people were ordinary, which is to say their lives were a long negotiation with money they did not have and land they could not keep. The point is not that they were miserable. The point is that the record shows a real texture debt, drowning, auctions, intermarriage, the constant low hum of not quite enough, and the book shows you a single bright Christmas and lets you assume the rest was the same temperature. It was not the same temperature, and it was about to get colder, fast, because of something happening hundreds of miles to the south that had nothing at all to do with Wisconsin weddings and everything to do with where Eliza's brother Joseph was about to go. Eliza married Peter in June of 1861. 2 months before that, in April of 1861, the guns had opened on a place called Fort Sumter. The country was coming apart, and the Quiner family, the drowned father's children, the ones who had already paid once were about to be asked to pay again. Here is the cruel part about 1861 and about every year like it. For a long time, nothing about it feels like history. It feels like Tuesday. The war that would eventually take Joseph Quiner did not arrive in Wisconsin as cannon fire. It arrived as news. Paper. Words read aloud at a store counter. Passed hand to hand. Argued about after church. Fort Sumter fell in April. President Lincoln called for volunteers. And in 1,000 small Wisconsin towns, young men started doing the thing young men do when a war is new and far away and sounds, from a distance, like a chance to matter. They started signing up. But that was happening over there, in the part of life that was about the country. In the part of life that was about Eliza, the year was almost unbearably normal. She was 19. She was newly married. She and Peter had no land of their own. Peter Ingalls, the record is fairly blunt about this, never managed to own land in Wisconsin at all. So the young couple did what young broke couples did inside a big family. They lived close to his parents, folded into the household, in and around Waterloo, sharing walls and work with the older Ingalls. It was not independence, it was survival arithmetic, but it was a life. It was a marriage. It was a kitchen, and a season, and a man coming in from the fields. And by the back half of 1861, it was something more than that. Eliza was pregnant. I want you to hold those two facts side by side, because the whole weight of this story lives in the gap between them. On one side, a 19-year-old woman in a borrowed corner of a crowded farmhouse, carrying her first child, doing the small, endless work of getting a household and a body ready for a baby, counting weeks, letting out seams, the most ordinary, most hopeful thing a human being does. On the other side, her older brother Joseph, the steady one, the load-bearing wall, putting his name on a list that would send him south. Joseph Quiner enlisted. He went into the 16th Wisconsin Infantry, a brand new regiment, raised from exactly these kinds of towns, full of exactly these kinds of men, farmers, brothers, sons of widows, men who had never been in a battle and had no real idea what one was, because almost no one alive in Wisconsin in 1861 did. The war was still young enough that men could walk into it imagining it. Think about who Joseph was when he did that. Not a boy with nothing to lose, the opposite. He was the eldest son of a drowned man. He was the one who had spent his whole life being the steady centre after the lake took their father. For him to leave for him, of all the Quiner children, to be the one who marched away meant the family was giving up the very person it had leaned on hardest. The wall was walking out of the house, and nobody in that family could say no to it. That is the thing about that moment in America. The pull was enormous, and the machinery was patriotic, and a young man who wanted to go was very hard to hold. So, they let him go. The drowned father's eldest surviving son went south to a war, and the family that had already lost the top of one generation watched the top of the next generation leave on a train. Now the timing. Watch the timing, because it is going to do something terrible, and it is going to do it quietly. Eliza is pregnant from the winter of 1861 into the spring of 1862. Her baby is due in the spring. Joseph is in camp, then on the move south, through that same winter and into that same spring. 2 clocks, one counting up toward a birth, one counting down toward a battle, and in the early months of 1862, both clocks are running toward the same few days in late April, and nobody in Wisconsin knows it, because nobody ever knows it. That is not how it feels from the inside. From the inside, it is just 2 ordinary things: a sister waiting for a baby, a brother waiting for orders happening in 2 different places, connected by nothing but blood and bad luck, and a calendar that does not care. This is the stretch the books erase most completely, and they erase it the easiest way there is, by skipping it. Little House in the Big Woods opens with Laura as a small child in the early 1870s. Everything I am describing, the drowning, the auctions, the 3 weddings, the war, the brother, all of it is already a decade in the past before the first page Laura ever wrote. It is the buried foundation under the cabin. The Christmas chapter sits on top of it like a rug over a trapdoor. So, let me hold us here, in early 1862, on purpose, because the people living it did not get to skip it, and tonight, neither do we. It is winter in Wisconsin. Eliza is in the late, heavy months of her first pregnancy, in a house that is not hers, in a family that has no money, and has just sent its steadiest son to war. The cold gets into everything. The work does not stop because you are tired or frightened or carrying a child. The water still has to be hauled, the fire still has to be fed, the wash still has to be done with hands that crack in the cold. She does it. Women did it. There is no softer way to say it. She kept a household running through the last months of her pregnancy, while her brother was somewhere south of her, in a place she could not picture, and she had no way to know if he was warm, or fed, or alive, except for letters that came when they came and said what little they said. And then spring starts to come, the ground softens, the baby gets close, and 400 miles to the south, in the corner of southwest Tennessee, near a little log church the locals called Shiloh, a Hebrew word. As it happens, that means place of peace. Joseph Quiner's brand new regiment is camped near a river landing called Pittsburgh Landing, in a position they do not understand the importance of, in front of an army they do not know is coming. The sister is days from a birth. The brother is hours from the worst morning of his life. Neither of them knows. That is the part I keep coming back to. Neither of them knows that the 2 clocks have almost run out, and that they are about to stop within the same handful of days, one with a first cry, one with a last breath. Hold the baby in one hand and the battle in the other. We are about to watch them happen. But first you have to understand what Shiloh actually was, because if you only know it as a name, you do not yet know what it did to Joseph, or to the family waiting on him, or to the quiet woman who would name a baby while it was killing him. On the morning of the 6th of April, 1862, the war stopped being far away. For a year it had been camps and drills and waiting. Long stretches of boredom, bad food, disease that killed more men than bullets did. The 16th Wisconsin had done the thing new regiments do. They had marched and waited and learned to be soldiers in the slow administrative sense without yet learning the only lesson that counts. They were camped near Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River among tens of thousands of other Union men. Many of them, that first weekend of April, were still settling in. Some had not yet been issued the full hard truth of what they were a part of. And in the grey before dawn on the 6th, the Confederate Army came out of the woods. That first morning is often remembered as a shock. Many Union units near Pittsburgh Landing were green, scattered, and not fully prepared for the scale of the Confederate attack, even though historians still debate how complete that surprise really was. What cannot be debated is the human experience of it. Before sunrise, Confederate troops came through the woods and hit men who had never heard a volley fired in anger. Some were cooking, some were forming, some were still trying to understand what was happening. A distant war became close in a single morning. The 16th Wisconsin was near the front of that. Joseph Quiner's regiment, the new men from the small towns, was posted out toward the forward edge, one of the units that took the first weight of the assault. They were ordered to hold their sections left, to keep a line from folding, in a stretch of ground that the day would make famous. For the most horrible reason a piece of ground can become famous. The soldiers who survived it gave it a name. They said the bullets came so thick through the trees and the brush that it sounded like a swarm, like walking into a nest of hornets. So that is what they called the place where the line held longest and the killing was worst, the hornet's nest. That is where Joseph Quiner spent the last morning of his health. In a green regiment, on contested ground, in a sound like the world tearing, holding a line because that was the order and because the men beside him were holding it too. Understand what that asks of a person. He had never done this. None of them had. There was no veteran instinct to fall back on. There was just the noise and the smoke and the men dropping and the simple animal decision to stay in a place that every nerve in your body is begging you to leave. He stayed long enough to be hit. The record does not give us the cinematic version, and I am not going to invent one for you, because the truth is bad enough, and inventing would be a kind of theft from a real man. We do not know the exact minute. We do not know whether it was early in the chaos or hours in. What the record holds is this. At the Battle of Shiloh, also called the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, Joseph C. Quiner of the 16th Wisconsin Infantry was wounded, not killed outright, wounded, which in 1862 was its own particular sentence, and often a slower and worse one than death on the field. Because here is what a battlefield wound meant in that war. Medicine had not caught up to the weapons. The rifles and the artillery could tear a body apart in ways that the surgeons simply could not repair. There were no antibiotics. There was no real understanding of infection. Surgeons went from man to man with the same unwashed hands and the same unwashed instruments. A wound that would be survivable today was, in that field, very often the beginning of a death that took days or weeks, in a tent or a commandeered building, in heat and filth and a level of pain we now have the mercy to barely imagine. The field hospitals of Shiloh were a horror that hardened veterans wrote about for the rest of their lives. Piles of amputated limbs outside the surgeon's tent. Men laid in rows on the bare ground, in the rain, waiting. The lucky ones unconscious, the unlucky ones not. Joseph was put into that system. Wounded on the 6th, he did not die on the 6th. He was carried off the line and into the long, grinding machinery of Civil War medicine. And he began the thing that thousands of men at Shiloh began that weekend, the slow business of either healing or not healing, with the odds set against him by everything science did not yet know. And while that was happening to him, while the steady sun, the wall the family leaned on, lay wounded somewhere in Tennessee, let me tell you what the numbers around him were. Shiloh was, when it happened, the bloodiest battle in American history to that point. Over 2 days, the two armies suffered about 23,700 casualties between them, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. For many Americans, Shiloh was the moment the war stopped looking short, clean, or controllable. Joseph Quiner was one of those 23,000. One name inside a number so large it stops meaning anything. That is what a casualty figure does. It takes a man who was the oldest son of a drowned trader, the one who stood in his dead father's place, the brother a pregnant 19-year-old in Wisconsin was praying for, and it turns him into a fraction of a statistic in a battle report. But he was not a statistic to the people in Wisconsin. To them, he was Joseph. And in the days after the 6th of April, what they had was what families always had in that war: nothing. Silence. The unbearable lag. News of a battle would reach the hometowns as a thunderclap and then a void. Everyone knew there had been a great fight at a place called Shiloh. The papers were full of it. The casualty lists were coming, and then you waited. You waited to find your name in a column of small print. You waited for a letter that might be from him, or might be about him. You waited while the mail crawled north at the speed of 1,862, which is to say the speed of a man on a horse and a train that came when it came. So now hold the two clocks again, because this is the hinge of the entire story, and I want you to see both hands of both clocks at once. In a field hospital in Tennessee, Joseph Quiner is wounded and fighting an infection he cannot win, the days bleeding into each other through the middle of April. And in Wisconsin, his little sister Eliza, who does not yet have any way of knowing what shape her brother is in, who may have heard only that there was a battle, who is holding her family's fear in a body that is already at the absolute limit of what a body can hold, goes into labour. The baby is coming. In the family history record used here, the date attached to Alice Josephine's birth is the 28th of April, 1862. Write that date down, because it is also the other date. It is the date the record gives for the day Joseph finally lost his fight in that hospital and died of his wounds. The same day, the 28th of April, 1862. A first breath in Wisconsin and a last breath in Tennessee, on the same square of the same calendar, in the same family, 400 miles apart, neither one knowing about the other. Read it again. Something in you wants it not to be true. I understand that. Let me show you exactly how the record holds it, because this is the centre of everything, and it deserves to be handled with both hands. Here is how the record holds it. On the pioneer history side, the careful genealogical work that tracks the real people behind the books, the birth of Eliza and Peter Ingalls' first child, a daughter named Alice Josephine Ingalls, is dated to the 28th of April, 1862. On the military side, the battlefield records, the regimental rolls, the work of the historians who keep the names of the men who fell the death of Joseph C. Quiner of the 16th Wisconsin, of the wounds he took at Shiloh, is dated to the 28th of April, 1862. Two different kinds of record, two different archives, kept by two different sets of people for two completely different reasons. A family history researcher tracing a baby's birthday. A battlefield trust tracing a soldier's death. They have no reason to agree, they were never written to line up, and they land on the same day. That is not a thing a writer arranges. That is the thing a writer would never dare to invent, because it is too neat and too cruel and no editor would believe it. It is only allowed to exist because it is true, because it actually happened to actual people, and the paper just sat there in two separate places for 160 years, waiting for someone to put the two pages side by side. Now, I have to be honest with you about what the record does not say, because this story is only worth telling if I keep faith with the truth, even when the truth is less tidy than the drama wants. The record does not tell us that Eliza knew. It cannot. News from Shiloh took weeks to crawl north. A wounded man in a Tennessee field hospital was not sending daily updates. The family would have learned of his death by letter, or by a name in a printed list, days or even weeks after the fact. So the most likely truth, and I want you to feel how this is somehow worse, not better, is that on the day Eliza held her newborn daughter for the first time, she did not yet know that her brother had died that same afternoon. She was happy. She was exhausted and happy in the specific way of a woman who has just survived a first birth and been handed a living child. And the grief was already real, already true, already 400 miles south with his name on it. It just had not reached her yet. It was in the mail. It was coming up the road toward her while she counted her baby's fingers. That is the cruelest version, and it is the most likely one, and the record lets us sit in it without forcing it. And then, because the Quiner women kept writing to each other, because that is how scattered frontier families stayed families, we get the most extraordinary thing in this entire story. We get Eliza's own voice. There is a letter. Eliza wrote it that same year, 1862, to her sister Martha, the older Quiner sister who had stayed back in another county. It survived, and it is so ordinary that it will take the wind out of you. She writes, and I am giving you her own words, kept by the people who keep these things. We have had an increase in our family since last we wrote you, but I suppose you have heard of it before this time. She is the prettiest little girl you ever saw. The prettiest little girl you ever saw. That is a new mother. That is Eliza, 19, 20 years old, doing the oldest thing there is, bragging, gently, about her baby, to her sister, on paper. because they lived too far apart to do it across a table. She goes on. She mentions that Caroline and Charles' Ma and Pa, your Ma and Pa, had been up to visit, and went home that day. So you get this small, warm, completely real picture. The two married Quiner sisters, Caroline and Eliza, together over a new baby, the whole little knot of the family closing in around the child the way families do, Pa there too, an ordinary visit. People you know, being people, in a kitchen in 1862. And then Eliza breaks off the letter mid-thought, and the reason she gives is the most human line in the whole archive. She writes that she has to stop because, in her words, the baby wants me to take her. The baby is fussing. Alice wants to be picked up. So Eliza puts down the pen in the middle of a sentence to her sister to go lift her daughter, and she hands the letter to Peter to finish. And Peter finishes it. And what does the man write? At the bottom of his wife's letter, in the spring and summer of the year his brother-in-law is dying or has just died at Shiloh, he writes about the crops. Crops are very good. Our wheat is just heading out. And then, almost shy, I can't think of what to write. If I could see you, we could find plenty to talk about. That is the letter. A pretty baby, a sister's visit, wheat heading out in the field, a husband who can't think of what to say on paper, the baby fussing to be held. Now lay that letter over the calendar. Somewhere under those cheerful, ordinary sentences, under the prettiest little girl you ever saw, under the good wheat is a brother in a grave in Tennessee, or about to be in one. His death dated to the very day the baby in that letter was born. The letter does not mention him, maybe because, when she wrote it, the news had not yet come. Maybe because, by the time she wrote it, the news had come, and there was simply nothing a person could put on paper that would hold it. So she wrote about the baby instead, because the baby was alive and in her arms, and the wheat was a thing you could still be sure of. That is what survival actually looks like. Not speeches, not breakdowns. A woman writing the prettiest little girl you ever saw, while the worst thing in her family's year sits in the silence around the words. People did not get to stop and grieve properly. The cows still needed milking, the baby still wanted holding, the wheat still headed out. Grief got folded into the few minutes between the chores, the same way it had been folded in when the lake took their father, and the household kept running, because households had to keep running, or everyone in them starved. This is the woman Laura Ingalls Wilder later turned into a warm round aunt at a Christmas table. And you know what? She was a warm round aunt at a Christmas table. That part is true too. That is the thing I need you to hold, both halves of it at once, because the truth is in the holding of both. Eliza Quiner Ingalls really did go to that Christmas. She really did laugh in that warm room. She really was kind to a small girl named Laura. And she really had, underneath all of it, a father at the bottom of a lake and a brother in the ground at Shiloh and a baby whose birthday she could never again separate from a death. People are not one thing. They are the warm room and the buried grief, at the same time, in the same body, and the warmth is not a lie, just because the grief is also true. The warmth might even be the bravest thing about her. The books gave you the warmth, the grief stayed outside the frame. I am giving you both, because both are in the record, and because you are not a child at a Christmas table, you are an adult who can carry the whole weight of a real person, and a real person is heavier than a holiday. Let me ask you something, while we are sitting in this. Wherever you are tonight, and I genuinely want to know, so drop it in the comments, your town and your local time. It's become a quiet little map of everyone listening in the dark. Somewhere in your own family, there is probably a version of this letter, an ordinary note, a cheerful line written over the top of something nobody could say out loud. That is not a flaw in your family. That is what families are. That is what Eliza was doing. Keep it in mind as we go, because the rest of her life is going to be a long lesson in exactly that, in carrying things quietly and moving on and moving again and again and again. Because the baby in that letter lived, and so did Eliza, for a long, long time, and the life she lived after Shiloh is the part the books closed the book on. It is also the part that turns the one warm Christmas you were given into something you will not be able to read the same way again. So far, the record has shown us a woman the books never did, a child of a drowning, a sister of a soldier, a young mother writing cheerful letters over the top of a fresh grave. What the record has not yet shown us is the single scene the whole world does know her by. So let us finally walk into it, the warm room, the Christmas, and watch what the book does with a woman we now actually understand. The chapter is called, simply, Christmas. It is the 4th chapter of Little House in the Big Woods, the first book Laura Ingalls Wilder ever published. In 1932, 70 years after the spring at Shiloh. In it, a small Laura, 4 or 5 years old, living in the log house in the Wisconsin woods, gets the most exciting news a frontier child could get. Company is coming. Not just any company. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins are coming through the snow to spend Christmas. And it is, genuinely, one of the loveliest things Wilder ever wrote. The cousins arrive bundled in the wagon. There are Alice and Ella and Peter and the baby. The cabin, which is usually just the 4 of them, swells with children. There is Cousin Peter to play with. There are the girls. There is the specific electric joy of a child whose quiet house has suddenly filled up with other children. Uncle Peter teases them about whether they have been good enough to deserve anything but a switch in their stockings. The grown women Ma and Aunt Eliza, the 2 Quiner sisters, work together in the kitchen, and the smell of cooking fills the place, and it is warm, and it is safe, and it is everything a holiday is supposed to be. It is real. I want to be clear about that. This almost certainly happened, in some form. The 2 sisters did live near each other, their families did visit, and a small Laura really did experience the overwhelming delight of cousins at Christmas. Wilder was not making it up. She was remembering a true warm thing from the bottom of a hard childhood and giving it to you whole. But look at who is in that kitchen. The 2 women cooking side by side are Caroline and Eliza Quiner. By the time of any Christmas, Laura could actually remember the late 1860s and the early 1870s. Both of those women have already lived everything we have spent this story uncovering. They were both small girls when their father drowned. They both grew up in the patched household of a remarried widow. They both married Ingalls brothers in that strange triple braid of weddings. And they had both, by then, lost their brother Joseph to Shiloh, Caroline's brother, Eliza's brother, the steady son, dead in a Tennessee hospital on the day Eliza's first baby was born. All of that is standing in the kitchen. 2 sisters who buried a father in a lake and a brother in a war, cooking Christmas dinner, being warm for the children, because that is what you do. The grief is not in the scene. The grief is under the scene, the same way it was under the letter, and a 4-year-old at the table has no way to see it. And so the book, written from a child's remembered point of view and later shaped with Rose Wilder Lane's editorial help, does not stop to show it either. That is not a lie. It is something quieter and more interesting than a lie. It is a point of view. Laura wrote, "The Christmas a child saw." The trouble is that, for 100 years, that child's eye view is the only view anyone has been handed, and a child's eye view of a grieving woman is a woman who seems perfectly fine, warm, round, kind, carrying nothing. There is one detail in that chapter that I have to give you, because it is small and charming, and then, once you know the rest, it stops being only charming. The baby cousin in the Christmas chapter 1 of Eliza's Children is called, in the book and in the family, Dolly Varden. It is a funny, sweet little name, and Laura explains in her memoir that the child, whose real name was Edith, we got the nickname because she had a dress made out of a particular bright calico print called Dolly Varden, a pink and white pattern, and a style of dress that had become a fashion craze after a character of that name in a Charles Dickens novel. So there is a cousin at the Christmas, a little girl in a cheerful printed dress, nicknamed after a Dickens character and a calico fad. Hold that image. A poor frontier family, a couple who never owned land, who lived folded into relatives' houses, who were one bad season from nothing, and in the middle of them is a little girl in a bright printed dress with a literary nickname at a Christmas full of cousins. That is the human truth that survives alongside the hardship. They were broke and grieving, and they still named a baby after a Dickens fashion and dressed her in pink calico and brought her through the snow to a holiday. The warmth was not fake. The warmth was insistence. It was people deciding, against the actual weight of their lives, to make a child a bright dress and a funny name and a Christmas worth remembering. And it worked. It worked so well that 90 years later, a small girl who was there grew up to write it into the first chapter of a book that would outlive everyone in that room. And the warmth she captured is so complete that the grief underneath it became invisible. Now here is the turn, and it is the turn this whole chapter has been walking toward. That Christmas is the high watermark of Eliza's appearances. That is essentially the last time the books really let you see her. After that warm chapter, Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins climb back into the wagon and drive off into the snow, and they drive more or less out of the story for good. They turn up as names here and there in the later books, a reference, a mention, a family connection. But the camera never follows them home. You never see where they went. You never see what the warm round aunt's life actually became after the wagon left the clearing. So let me do the thing the books did not. Let me follow the wagon. Because what happened to Eliza Quiner Ingalls after that Christmas is the long, quiet, grinding reality that the holiday chapter was built to keep you from feeling. It is not dramatic the way Shiloh is dramatic. There is no single terrible day. It is worse than that, in a slower way. It is a whole life of not being able to land, of a husband who could never hold ground, of moving and moving and moving, of a flood, of widowhood, of an old age spent as a guest in other people's houses, hundreds of miles from the sister she cooked that Christmas dinner beside. The wagon that drove out of the big woods was not driving home to a homestead. It was driving into 30 more years of the same instability the Quiners and the Ingallses had been living in the whole time. Follow it. You will not look at the Christmas chapter the same way again. The wagon went to Pepin County first. By the middle of the 1860s, Eliza and Peter had left the household near Waterloo, where Alice was born, and moved to Pepin County, Wisconsin, the same country, more or less, that the Big Woods books are set in. A second daughter, Ella, was born there in January of 1865. So far, so ordinary. A young family, a couple of small children moving once to find a better spot. Every family did that. But then they moved again, to Pierce County. And there a third child came, Peter Franklin, in 1866. And then a fourth Lansford Newcomb named for Peter's restless father in 1870. And then a fifth Edith Florence, the little Dolly Varden of the Christmas chapter in 1872. 5 children, and I want you to notice something about that list, because the record is quietly telling you something through it. The children are born in different counties. Waterloo, Pepin, Pierce. The family is not staying put. They are moving every few years, and the births are the mile markers of it. And here is the line in the record that turns the moving from a habit into a verdict. Peter Ingalls, the historians note, does not appear to have ever owned land in Wisconsin at all. Not a farm. Not a claim that held. The researchers tracking the family suspect that Peter and Eliza were living with Peter's parents, old Lansford and Laura Ingalls, the same couple who had lost their own farm at the sheriff's auction, or else renting a house or a piece of ground from someone who did own it. Let that sit. For roughly the first dozen years of her marriage, Eliza Quiner Ingalls did not have a home of her own. She had her husband, and a growing row of children, and a series of other people's houses. She was a wife and a mother of 5 who had never once stood on ground that her own family held the deed to. Now, does that sound familiar? It should, because it is, almost exactly, the shape of the more famous marriage in this family. Charles Ingalls Parr was a restless man who moved his family again and again across the frontier, chasing the next piece of ground that was finally going to be the one. Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, back to Wisconsin, Iowa, Dakota. The Little House books turn that restlessness into the engine of an adventure Parr, with his fiddle and his far-off look, always sure the next place would be better. And underneath that adventure, doing the actual work of surviving each move, was Caroline, Ma, the woman who packed the wagon and unpacked it, who made each bare new place into a home and then watched it get left behind, who carried the cost of one man's restlessness without ever getting a verse of the song. What the record shows you, when you follow Eliza, is that this was not unique to Pa and Ma. It was the family pattern. Peter Ingalls had the same restless feet as his brother Charles. He moved his family the same way, never landing, never holding, always one more relocation toward a stability that did not come. And Eliza did exactly what her sister Caroline did. In exactly the same years she absorbed it. She made the homes. She had the babies in the new counties. She did the female labour that no deed records and no book celebrates. The difference between the two sisters is not how they lived. It is who told the story afterward. Caroline had a daughter named Laura who grew up to be a writer, and turned her mother's endurance into one of the most beloved figures in American letters. Eliza had no such daughter. No one wrote her down. So Caroline became Ma Sainted, remembered, the warm centre of a national myth, and Eliza became 4 minutes at a Christmas table and then nothing. Same life, same restlessness absorbed. Same cost paid. One sister got a monument, the other got a wagon driving off into the snow and 100 years of silence. In 1874, the wagon went further, out of Wisconsin entirely, into Minnesota to a little town called Zumbro Falls, on the south bank of the Zumbro River, in Wabasha County. And here, for the first time, the record lets Peter do a hopeful thing. He bought a lot, an actual lot, in the original town, on the south side of the river. After all those years of other people's houses, there was finally a piece of ground with the Ingalls name attached to it. Peter worked there as a labourer and a carpenter, a man building other people's things for wages, which is its own quiet story about how far the family fortune had not come. And a sixth child, the last one, was born there. Edmund Llewellyn in 1880, when Eliza was 38. So picture it. Around 1880, Eliza finally has something like a settled life, a town, a lot by the river, a husband with steady enough work, 6 children, the older ones starting to grow up and pair off. After the drowning, after the auctions, after Shiloh, after a dozen years of moving through other people's houses, a home by a river in a Minnesota town. You can almost let yourself believe the hard part is behind her. And then the river took it. In 1888, the Zumbro River flooded, and the flood destroyed the Ingalls home in Zumbro Falls. Read that and feel the awful rhyme of it. The first catastrophe of Eliza's life was water the lake that took her father when she was 3. And now, near the end of her middle age, after she had finally bought a home on the bank of a river, water came again and took the house. The one piece of ground the family had managed to plant itself on, washed out by the same element that had started the whole story. By then most of the children were grown and married and gone scattered out of the house the way frontier children scattered, into their own marriages and their own moves. So it was Peter and Eliza and the youngest, Edmund, who picked through what the flood had left and decided there was nothing to do but move again. They went north to Mille Lacs in Mille Lacs County, Minnesota. One more town, one more start. Eliza was in her late 40s now, beginning again, for what must have felt like the 100th time, in a new place, with a husband and a last child and not much else. She had been moving her whole life, from the drowned family to the remarried one, from Waterloo to Pepin to Pierce, to Zumbro Falls to Mille Lacs. From other people's houses to a home by a river to a home the river destroyed, the wagon that drove out of the big woods Christmas had never really stopped. It just kept going, county after county, decade after decade, while the books stayed behind in the warm cabin with the cousins and let you believe that the warmth was the whole of it. And in Mille Lacs, in March of 1900, the moving finally stopped for Peter. He died there. Eliza was a widow. She was 57 years old. She had buried her father in a lake, her brother in a war, and now her husband of nearly 40 years in a Minnesota town, a long way from where either of them had started. The children were grown and gone to their own lives, in their own directions, across a country that had spread out enormously since the Quiner girls were small. And what happened to Eliza after Peter died is, in some ways, the quietest and saddest part of the whole long record. Because a widow with no land and no home of her own, in 1900, had only one place to go. She had to go and live in her children's houses, one at a time, wherever there was room. There is a particular kind of poverty that does not look like poverty. It looks like a polite old woman with a packed trunk, welcome everywhere, at home nowhere. That is what the last 30 years of Eliza's life became. When Peter died in 1900, Eliza had no home of her own to keep. There was no farm to run, no house with her name on the deed, no piece of the world that was simply hers to grow old in. There had never been... Not really, the lot in Zumbro Falls had gone to the flood, and before that it had been a dozen years of other people's houses. So, at 57, a widow, she did the only thing a woman in her position could do. She went to live with her children, and then with the next one, and then the next. Follow the route, because the route is the whole story. First she went to her daughter Edith Little Dolly Varden of the Christmas chapter, the girl in the bright calico dress, now a grown married woman out in North Dakota. So the baby in the pink print dress became the daughter who took her widowed mother in. There is something almost unbearably tender in that, and something hard underneath it too. The child Eliza had once dressed up and brought through the snow to a holiday was now the roof over her head. Then the country pulled her further. Her son Edmund, the youngest, the one born in Zumbro Falls in 1880, the last child went west, all the way to Stevens County, in the far northeast corner of Washington state. And Eliza went with him, from North Dakota to Washington, a woman in her 60s who had been born in Wisconsin when it was barely a state, now living in the Pacific Northwest, about as far from the big woods as the map allowed. And then Edmund decided to move again because of course he did, because the restless Ingalls feet did not stop with Peter, and this time Eliza did not go with him. Instead she went south, to California. And in California she settled into the final rhythm of her life, alternating between the homes of her two oldest daughters, Alice and Ella, a season with one, a season with the other, the trunk packed and unpacked, a guest in one daughter's house, then a guest in the other's. Think about what that life actually was, day to day. It was not cruel. Her children clearly loved her. They took her in, one after another, across thousands of miles, for decades. That is not neglect, that is devotion. But it was rootless. It was an old age with no fixed point. Every room she slept in was on loan. Every kitchen she sat in was someone else's. She had spent her whole life making homes for other people, for Peter, for 6 children, in county after county, and at the end she had no home of her own to be made in. She lived inside her children's lives because she had no separate life left to live in. And here is the geography that breaks my heart, quietly when I lay it next to the beginning. Eliza Quiner was born in Wisconsin in 1842, the daughter of a Great Lakes trader, in a world of log houses and ox teams and the near frontier. She died. We will get to exactly when, in Eagle Rock, California. Eagle Rock is in Los Angeles. By the time she was living out her last years there, she was an old pioneer woman in the orange grove edge of a city that was about to become the center of American film, surrounded by automobiles and electric light, and a century she had watched arrive piece by piece. From an ox cart in territorial Wisconsin to the outskirts of Los Angeles, she lived the entire transformation of the country, all the way across it, west and west and west, until there was no more west to go. And the sister she had cooked that Christmas dinner beside Caroline, Ma, was 1,000 miles away the whole time, in De Smet, South Dakota, living out her own old age in the town where the Ingalls family had finally, after all the moving, stopped. The 2 Quiner sisters, who had started in the same drowned father household, who had married 2 brothers, who had buried the same brother on the same terrible spring day, ended their lives at opposite ends of the country, growing old separately, an entire continent between them. The little girls who once cooked side by side in a log cabin kitchen finished their lives as 2 old women separated by an entire continent, with no clear record here of a final meeting. Caroline died first. Ma died on the 20th of April, 1924, in De Smet, at the age of 84. And her death was not quiet. In the long run, because her daughter's books were about to make her immortal, Caroline Ingalls would get a grave that people travel to, a marked plot in a Dakota cemetery that readers visit on purpose, leaving flowers, because she is Ma, because a small girl named Laura turned her into one of the most loved mothers in American storytelling. People who never knew her still travel to that grave because the books made her feel like family. That is what it means to be written down by the right person. Eliza outlived her sister by 7 years. So picture those last 7 years. An old woman in California, in her daughter's spare rooms, reading if the news even reached her, and it may well have that her little girl sister Caroline had died back in Dakota, and was being mourned by a whole country of strangers because of some books a niece had written. Eliza had been in those books. She was Aunt Eliza. She was the warm, round woman at the Christmas. She had cooked beside Caroline in the kitchen those stories came from. And now Caroline was becoming an American literary mother with a grave readers would remember, while Eliza was an aging guest in her daughter's house in Los Angeles, far from Wisconsin, with a brother in a Tennessee war grave and a husband in a Minnesota one. She had carried the same losses. She had absorbed the same restlessness. She had done the same uncredited work. And she got the silence. That is not bitterness on my part, and I do not think it was bitterness on hers. There is no evidence she was anything but a beloved grandmother and mother, taken in and cared for to the end. But the record makes the contrast impossible to miss, and the contrast is the point. 2 sisters, the same life, the same griefs. One remembered as long as America remembers anything. One folded into 4 minutes of a Christmas chapter and then let go. The wagon that drove out of the big woods drove all the way to the Pacific, and got old, and got tired, and finally stopped in the suburbs of a city the Quiner girls could never have imagined when they were small. We will let it stop there in a moment. But before Eliza dies, I owe you the rest of her family, because she was not the only Quiner the lake and the war marked, and the baby in that letter, the one born the day Joseph died, lived a whole life that says something about all of this. Start with Alice. Alice Josephine Ingalls, the daughter born on the 28th of April, 1862, the prettiest little girl her mother ever saw, the baby who wanted holding in the middle of a letter lived. That is the thing to hold on to. The child whose birthday fell on the day her uncle died did not become a tragedy. She grew up. She became a woman. She married a man named Arthur Whiting and had a life of her own. And here the family does its uncanny thing one more time, because Alice's sister Ella, the second daughter, born in Pepin County in 1865, married a man named Lee Whiting. 2 Ingalls sisters married 2 Whiting men. If that pattern rings a bell, it should. It is the exact echo of their own parents' generation, where 2 Quiner sisters married 2 Ingalls brothers. The braid repeated. A generation later, the same close-knit marry-the-family-next-door instinct produced the same kind of double bond. These were not people with a wide field of choices. They married who was near, who was known, who was kin-adjacent, and they did it again and again, and the family tree grew in tight loops instead of wide branches. So the baby born on the day of Joseph's death lived a full life, married, and became eventually one of the daughters whose California home took in her own widowed mother at the end. The infant in the 1862 letter became the roof over Eliza's old age. The clock that started on the 28th of April, 1862, the one that began with a first cry, on the same day a soldier took his last breath, ran on for decades, all the way to the orange groves of Los Angeles. Life insisted on continuing the way it does, right over the top of the grave. Now let me give you the rest of them, the whole Quiner generation, because tonight is, in a way, about all of them. And because the books reduced every single one of these people to a name or a cameo or nothing at all. There was Joseph, the oldest, who we have buried at Shiloh, the steady son, the wall, gone at the war. There was Henry Quiner, one of Eliza's brothers, who married Polly Ingalls in 1859, the very first of the 3 Ingalls Quiner weddings. He is Uncle Henry in the Little House books, a familiar background figure, a man who helps with the harvest. A child reading those books has no idea that Uncle Henry was a son of the drowned trader, a brother of the dead soldier, part of the same hard family arithmetic as everyone else in this story. He is just a friendly uncle in a hayfield. That is what the books do. They take a man who carried the whole family history in him and they make him a pleasant face at a harvest. There was Thomas, the youngest Quiner brother, who turns up in the later books as Uncle Tom, and whose claim to a sentence of fame is that he went off to the Black Hills of Dakota to look for gold. A gold seeker. a man who chased the same dream of sudden fortune that pulled so many men west and broke most of them. The books mention him lightly. The reality was a man risking his life in illegally seized land for a fortune that, like most frontier fortunes, did not come. There was the mother Charlotte. The widow who held the whole thing together after the lake took her husband, who remarried to keep her children fed, who raised a generation that would scatter across the entire country. She is the root of all of it, and she is almost completely invisible in the popular story. Let me give her the minute the books never did, because she is the woman the whole story stands on, and you have not really met her. Her husband went down with the ocean somewhere off the Michigan shore, and the lake gave nothing back, not him, not a body, not even the small mercy of a place to grieve. One season, Charlotte Quiner was the wife of a trader who was away on a trip, the way he had been away 100 times before. The next, she was a widow with a house full of children and no husband ever coming up that road again. Count what she was left holding. 7 children had been born to her. The very first, a daughter, had died as a small child years earlier, so the firstborn grave was already behind her. She knew that particular cold too. That left the living ones. Joseph the oldest, then Henry, then Martha, then Caroline, then Eliza, then little Thomas. A line of children from nearly grown down to barely walking, and one woman to keep all of them alive, in Wisconsin, in the mid-1840s, with no husband, no income, and this is the part modern ears slide right past, almost no legal power to fix any of it. A widow in that time and place could not simply go and get the work, or the credit, or the property that would have put the household back on its feet. The law was not built to let her. She was meant to be attached to a man, and her man was at the bottom of a lake. So she did the only arithmetic there was, and she did it for 5 years, stretching the food, leaning on the older boys the moment they were old enough to be of use, teaching the girls young. The lesson frontier girls learned in the cradle that the household runs on the unpaid, unrecorded labour of women, and that grief is a thing you fit into the gaps between the work. Joseph became the steady centre. You already know what the war did to him. Caroline and Eliza learned their endurance standing at this woman's side, in these years, watching their mother do an impossible thing quietly, every single day, with no one to do it for her and no audience to notice that it was hard. And then, in 1849, Charlotte did the other practical, unromantic, life-saving thing a widow in her position could do. She married again a farmer named Frederick Holbrook, and in doing so she put a man's legal standing and a man's labour back underneath her children. It is easy from a soft distance to want that second marriage to be a love story, and perhaps in some measure it was, but the record lets you see it more plainly than that. It was survival. It was a woman doing the math and choosing the answer that kept her children fed and housed and standing on ground someone could legally hold. The family moved to a farm in Concord, in Jefferson County. There was a new half-sister, the one they called Lottie, and there, just to the south, were the Ingallses, which is how the 3 weddings, and everything that came after them, came to be at all. So every single thing in tonight's story runs back through Charlotte. The Quiner sisters who married the Ingalls brothers were raised by her. The brother who died at Shiloh was raised by her. The whole braided family that Laura would one day turn into a myth existed because one widow refused to let a drowning be the end of her children. And then because the war was not finished with this family, Charlotte lived to do the thing no parent should ever have to. She outlived her son. She had already, in a sense, buried a husband she could not bury, in a lake with no grave to stand at. In 1862, she buried Joseph too, the oldest, the steady one, dead of his wounds 400 miles south. A drowned husband and a soldier son. The lake and the war, a generation apart, each one taking a man out from under her, and each time leaving the woman standing in the house with the children and the work and the grief she had no time to take. And here is what the record holds of her own inner life, of what all of that did to her, of who Charlotte Quiner Holbrook actually was as a person on the inside. Almost nothing. A few dates. A marriage, a remarriage, a list of children, a death. The outline of a life that held an entire family together through 2 catastrophes, with almost none of the inside of it kept. We do not have her letters the way we have one of Eliza's. We do not have her voice at all, We have the fact of her, the load she carried, and then silence where the woman herself should be. That is the deepest version of the pattern this whole night has been tracing, and Charlotte is the proof of it carried all the way to the end. The more essential a woman's work was to a family's survival, the less the record tends to keep of her. Caroline got a daughter who wrote and became immortal. Eliza got a sister who kept one letter, and we can barely find her. Charlotte got neither, and she is nearly gone. The most important person in the story, the root the entire tree grew out of, and the one about whom we can say the least. Not because she did the least. Because she did the most, in exactly the place where no one writes anything down. So before we follow Eliza the rest of the way, give one quiet minute of this hour to the woman at the root. Charlotte Quiner Holbrook, widow of a drowned man, mother of a dead soldier, who held a family together through both and left almost no trace of what it cost her. She is the reason there was an Aunt Eliza to be warm at a Christmas at all. She is the reason there was a Ma. And she lies, like her daughter Eliza would, in the kind of silence the bright story always seems to reserve for the people who actually did the carrying. And there was Martha. Martha Jane Quiner, the older sister, the one who stayed back, the one Eliza was writing to in that letter. Of all the Quiner siblings, Martha is the one I want to leave you thinking about, because Martha is the reason you heard Eliza's voice at all tonight. Here is the quiet, beautiful mechanism of it. Eliza wrote her letters to Martha. Martha kept them. And because Martha kept them, because one forgotten sister held on to the words of another forgotten sister, those letters survived long enough to be found, generations later, by the patient researchers who dig the real people out from under the books. Without Martha's keeping, Eliza's prettiest little girl you ever saw would have evaporated like every other unrecorded sentence spoken in a frontier kitchen. The only reason we can stand here, at this hour, and hear a young mother brag about her baby in the spring of 1862 is that her sister thought the letter was worth saving. That is how the forgotten get remembered, when they get remembered at all. Not by monuments, not by books with their names on the cover, by some other overlooked person quietly keeping the paper. Martha did for Eliza what no one with a printing press ever did. She kept her real voice alive. And it is worth saying plainly, the famous version of this family, the one everyone knows, came from Laura keeping her memories. But there was a second, dimmer act of keeping going on at the same time, sister to sister, with no audience and no profit in it, and it preserved something the famous version left out the ordinary. Unedited, unsainted voice of a real woman on a real day. Two kinds of remembering. One built a myth that the whole world reads. One saved a single honest letter that almost no one has ever seen. Tonight, we needed both. The myth gave us the Christmas. The letter gave us the truth under it. And think for a moment about the children of the two famous sisters, because this is the detail that ties the whole knot together and then pulls it tight. Caroline's children were Mary, Laura, Carrie, Grace, and the baby boy Freddie who died. Eliza's children were Alice, Ella, Peter Franklin, Lansford, Edith, and Edmund. And because Caroline and Eliza were sisters who had married brothers, those two sets of children were double cousins bound twice over, sharing two full sets of grandparents as closely related as cousins can be. So, when Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down in the 1930s, an old woman herself by then, and wrote the Christmas chapter when she described Aunt Eliza and the cousins coming through the snow, she was writing about her own double cousins, children she had grown up tangled with. A whole second branch of her family that was as close to her as family gets. And she gave them one warm chapter and one funny nickname, and then she let them go and built the rest of the monument around her own mother and father and sisters, and the double cousins drove off into the snow and out of the American memory. It was not cruelty. A book can only hold so much. Every memoir is mostly the things it leaves out. But the leaving out has consequences, and the consequence here is a whole family, a brother dead at Shiloh, a sister who wandered a continent, 6 double cousins, a mother who survived a drowning compressed down into Aunt Eliza being warm at a holiday. The compression is the thing I keep circling, because it is the real subject of tonight. Not Eliza's sadness. She was not just sad, she was loved. She laughed. She bragged about her baby. She was taken in to the end. The subject is the compression. The way a real, whole, heavy human life gets squeezed down into a single warm scene, and the rest gets called unimportant by the simple act of not being written. So let me uncompress the last of it. Let me give Eliza the one thing the books never did. Let me follow her all the way to the end and say out loud the date and the place and the distance, and then ask what the whole thing was for. I've been careful all night not to point a finger. Let me stay careful now, because this next part is where a lesser telling would reach for a villain, and there is no villain here. There is only the arithmetic of who went and who stayed, and what that arithmetic did to the women left holding both ends of it. The war took Joseph, the oldest Quiner son, the steady one. It took him at Shiloh and it never gave him back. It did not take Charles Ingalls. It did not take Peter Ingalls. Pa and Uncle Peter, the two brothers who had married the two Quiner sisters, did not go south. They did not march. They did not stand in the hornet's nest. They stayed in Wisconsin through the war years, with their wives and families, while Joseph carried the Quiner name into the fighting. Charles and Caroline's first child, Mary, would not be born until 1865, nearly 3 years after Joseph's death, and Laura would come 2 years after that. So Caroline was not nursing a child while Joseph was dying, but she was still a sister, losing a brother while her own married life was just beginning. Now I want to handle this exactly right, because it is easy to make it sound like an accusation, and it is not one. The records here are genuinely incomplete. The Federal Enrollment Act of 1863 required registration for male citizens and eligible immigrants between 20 and 45, with different classes and exemptions inside that system. But the enrollment papers for the district that included Pepin County did not survive, so we cannot say for certain whether Charles Ingalls was enrolled, exempted, passed over, or simply never called. What the record does show is the plain fact: Charles Ingalls did not serve. He did not pay a substitute to go in his place, which many men did. He simply was not among the men who went, and neither was Peter. There were 100 ordinary, blameless reasons a married father on the frontier might not have gone. Men with young families and farms to keep were often the ones the war passed over, by exemption or by luck or by the simple chaos of how the draft actually worked. This was not cowardice, and there is nothing in the record to suggest it was. It was, most likely, just how the lottery fell. Some men's numbers came up and some men's did not, and some men were needed on the land, and the line between the soldier and the civilian was often nothing more principled than chance. But here is the thing the chance produced. In this one family, the war drew a line straight through the middle of it. On one side of the line, Joseph, the brother who went and died. On the other side, Charles and Peter, the brothers-in-law who stayed and lived and built families, and one of whom would father the woman who wrote the books. And the women stood on both sides of that line at once. Think about Caroline. Think about Ma. She was not living the same exact baby and battle calendar that Eliza was living. Mary would not be born until 1865. But she was living the same family wound. Her brother went south, her husband stayed home, her sister Eliza was pregnant. And when Joseph died, both Quiner sisters had to absorb the same news from 2 different rooms of the same family. Eliza held a newborn. Caroline held the beginning of a marriage that would soon become the Little House family. The 2 sisters were not mirror images in timing, but they were bound by the same loss. That is the cost the books never name, and it is the deepest current under this whole channel's worth of stories, so let me say it as plainly as I can. The frontier myth is a myth about men. The brave father, the restless dreamer, the pioneer with his eyes on the horizon, and the real, daily, load-bearing work of frontier life, the keeping of households through grief and poverty and constant moving, the having of babies in raw new counties, the absorbing of every loss so the family could keep functioning, that work was done by women, and it was done in silence. And the record of it is mostly the record of what they did not get to write down. Joseph got a battlefield and a death, and eventually a place in the rolls of the men who fell, a real, honourable, remembered thing. He is in the record as a soldier who gave his life. That matters, and it is right. But his sisters? Caroline and Eliza did not get a battle. They got the waiting, They got the letter that might come. They got the long afterward, the decades of carrying a dead brother around inside an ordinary life, the birthdays that were also death days, the Christmases cooked over the top of old graves. There is no medal for that. There is no monument to the woman who held the family together after the telegram. There is, in Caroline's case, a set of books that turned the holding into something beautiful, and in Eliza's case, not even that. Just a letter her sister kept. This is why, when this channel keeps coming back to the women, to Ma, to Mary, to Carrie, to the aunts, the books forgot it is not sentiment. It is correction. The men's side of this family is reasonably well recorded. Joseph the soldier, Charles the pioneer, Peter the wanderer, Thomas the gold seeker. It is the women's side that got compressed into warmth and silence. Caroline into a saint, Eliza into a Christmas, Martha into a keeper of letters, Charlotte into nothing at all. And the women's side is where the actual weight of the history sits. So when you read that warm Christmas chapter now, and I hope you do read it again, because it really is lovely, and knowing the truth does not ruin it, it deepens it. I want you to see the two women in the kitchen for what they were. Not background, not furniture. Two sisters, daughters of a drowned man, who had each just lived through the worst spring of their lives, standing at a stove, making a holiday for a house full of children, with a dead brother between them that neither one would ever mention, because mentioning it would not get the dinner cooked. That is not weakness. That is the strongest thing in the whole book, and it is the one thing the book does not tell you is there. And now, at last, we can let Eliza go, because there is one more date to read, and one more place, and then the distance, and then we are done. Eliza Quiner Ingalls died on the 6th of June, 1931, in Eagle Rock, California. She was 89 years old. Read that age. 89. The little girl who was 3 when the lake took her father lived to be 89 years old. She outlived her father by 87 years, her brother Joseph by 69, her husband Peter by 31, and her sister Caroline by 7. She lived from the territorial frontier of the 1840s to the edge of the Great Depression and the dawn of Hollywood. She saw the whole arc of it. The ox carts give way to the automobiles, the candle give way to the electric bulb, the log house give way to the bungalow in Los Angeles. Almost a full century. A long, long life. And it ended about as far from where it began as a life in America can end. She was born in the deep woods of territorial Wisconsin, and she died in the Orange Grove suburbs of Los Angeles, 2,000 miles west, in a daughter's house. An old pioneer woman in a brand new century. They buried her in Riverside County, California, out past the city, in dry inland ground that could not be more different from the cold green Wisconsin she came up in. Now stand both graves side by side, because this is the last thing the record has to show you, and it is the whole story in 2 headstones. Caroline's grave is in De Smet, South Dakota. It is a marked, known, visited place. People drive there. They make a point of it. They come from all over the country, all over the world, honestly because Caroline is Ma, and the Ingalls plot in De Smet is something close to sacred ground for the millions of people who grew up on the books and the show. There are tours, there are flowers left by strangers. There is a whole little economy of memory built around the family that finally stopped moving and settled in that Dakota town. Caroline Ingalls is one of the most visited dead mothers in America. Eliza's grave is in Riverside County, California. Almost no one goes there. Almost no one knows it exists. She lies in dry western ground, thousands of miles from the sister she cooked Christmas beside, under a name that means nothing to the people who love the books she was written into. The warm round aunt of the Christmas chapter, the woman who was in the most famous family memoir in American history, is buried in near total anonymity in a California town that has no idea it holds a piece of the little house story. Same family, same losses, same drowned father and same dead brother. 2 sisters who started in the same kitchen. One of them gets pilgrims, the other gets silence and dry grass. And the only difference, the only one, is which sister had a daughter who wrote. I keep saying that, and I am going to say it one more time, because it is the moral of the whole night and I do not want you to be able to unhear it. Eliza did not live a smaller life than Caroline. She did not love less, or lose less, or work less, or carry less. By the cold measure of years she lived longer, by the measure of distance she travelled farther. By the measure of loss she carried exactly the same weight, the same father in the same lake, the same brother in the same war, on the same impossible spring day. The two lives are equal in everything that actually counts. The only thing Caroline had that Eliza did not was a witness, a daughter standing close enough to the door when it opened to pick up the family's memory and carry it into print. Laura turned her mother into Ma. No one turned Eliza into anything. And so one sister became immortal, and the other became a name in a genealogy and a grave no one visits. Not because of anything either woman did, but because of who happened to be holding a pen in the next generation. That is how memory actually works. It is not a reward for the size of your life. It is an accident of who was watching, and whether they could write it down, and whether anyone wanted to read it. The unfairness of that is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. For every Ma Ingalls who gets a grave full of flowers, there are 100 Eliza Quiners in dry ground in distant states, who carried the same weight and got the same silence, and whose only trace is a letter a sister happened to keep. And here is the part that should sit with you longest, after the lights are out. Eliza is not the exception. Eliza is the rule. She is what almost everyone is. Almost no one gets the books written about them. Almost no one gets the grave that draws pilgrims. Almost everyone who has ever lived did what Eliza did, carried real losses through an ordinary life, kept the household running, wrote the cheerful letter over the top of the grief, and then died and was slowly forgotten by a world that had 1,000 other things to remember. The Carolines are the rare ones, the Elizas are the human condition. The books gave you Caroline, tonight gave you Eliza. And the reason it matters to dig her back out, the reason it is worth 2 hours of a quiet night, is that she stands in for everyone, the bright story left in the snow. Every aunt who got one chapter, every sister who kept the letters instead of writing the famous one, every woman who was warm in someone else's memory and is buried, now, where no one comes. So that is the life. Born to a drowned father in 1842, married into a restless family in 1861, mother on the day her brother died in 1862, warm at one Christmas, a niece would make famous. Then a wagon, and another wagon, and a flood, and a widowing, and 30 years as a guest in her children's houses, all the way across the country, to a grave in the California hills in 1931. One Christmas in the book, a whole life out of it. Let me take you back to that Christmas now, one last time, because I promised you, at the very start, that you would not be able to read it the same way again, and now you have everything you need to test whether that is true. Let me put you inside one day, not Eliza's whole life one day, the day the news finally reached Wisconsin, because the record can give you the dates, but only standing in the room can give you the weight, and you have earned the weight by now. So, you are Eliza. It is late spring 1862, and you are not thinking about a battle. You are thinking about the baby. She is a few weeks old now. She sleeps in the day and wakes in the night, the way they do, and you have not had a full night's sleep since she came, and you do not mind, because she is the prettiest little girl you ever saw, and you cannot stop looking at her. Your body is still healing. Everything aches in the low, ordinary way it aches after a birth. The house, your husband's people's house, not yours, never quite yours, is warm with early summer now. The cold of the winter finally gone out of the boards. Outside, the wheat is heading out. Peter said so in the letter you both wrote to your sister Martha. Good crops this year. The fields are green and moving in the wind, and the whole world smells like growing things. You picked up the pen to write Martha, and you had to put it down in the middle because the baby wanted holding, and you laughed about it, and handed the page to Peter to finish. And he wrote about the wheat, because he never knows what to write. It is, by every measure you have, a good season. A hard year, money tight as always, but a living baby and a heading field and a husband and your sister Caroline just up the road with her own little one. Your brother Joseph is away at the war, and you worry about him the way everyone worries about the men who went. A low background worry you have learned to carry under everything else. But the last you heard, he was alive. The papers were full of a great battle down in Tennessee, some place called Shiloh, terrible numbers, but you have not heard your brother's name, and no news is good news, and the wheat is heading out, and the baby is asleep. And then someone comes up the road. Maybe it is a rider, maybe it is your stepfather, or a neighbour, or one of your brothers, with a face you can read before they are close enough to speak. Maybe it is a letter, carried in and set on the table, the handwriting on it not Joseph's. However it comes the way that kind of news always comes, as a small interruption in an ordinary afternoon, a knock or a step or an envelope, nothing that looks like the end of the world until you open it. And then you know, Joseph is dead, wounded at that battle, at Shiloh, weeks ago back in April, and he did not recover. He died in a hospital down there, a long way from home, on the 28th of April. The 28th of April. You do the arithmetic without meaning to, because a mother always knows the date, and your hand goes cold before your mind has even finished. The 28th of April is the day your daughter was born. The day you held her for the first time. The day you were happier than you had been in years. That was the day. That whole bright day you spent looking at your new baby's face. He was dying. While you counted her fingers, 400 miles south your big brother was leaving the world. The first day of her life and the last day of his were the same day, and you did not know, you had no way to know. You were laughing and he was going, at the same hour, under the same sun. Now you have a baby in one arm, and that knowledge in the rest of you, and there is no one to take either of them. This is the part I want you to feel, because this is the part that was real, and it was real for so many women in that war, and in every war, and in every family that ever lost someone in a season that was supposed to be happy. You cannot fall down. The baby needs feeding. The wheat needs tending. Caroline needs telling, and she is going to take it the same way you are taking it, because he was her brother too, and now the two of you are sisters with a dead brother and live babies. And the dinner still has to be made. There is no room set aside for this. There is no time given to you for it. The grief has to be folded into the minutes between the chores, because that is the only place there is room, and the chores do not stop coming. So you fold it in. You write the letters that have to be written. You hold the baby. You go on. Years from now, you will write to your sister Martha again, and you will not be able to put any of this on the page, because some things do not go onto a page, they just go into you and stay there. And the only trace that will survive, the only proof that you were ever a young woman holding a baby on the day your brother died, is a cheerful note about a pretty little girl and some wheat heading out in a field, kept by a sister who loved you, found 160 years later by a stranger, trying to dig the real you out from under a Christmas chapter. That is the day. That is what the record will not say, and what standing in the room makes unbearable. A birth and a death on one square of the calendar, and a woman who had to keep living in the space between them. Step back out of the room now. You are yourself again, in your own night with your own losses, whatever they are. But carry that one day out with you, because it is the truest thing in this whole story, and it is the thing the warm chapter was built to keep you from ever having to feel. Now, the Christmas, as promised, one last time, go back to the warm room. It is the 4th chapter of the gentlest book about an American childhood, and the cousins are coming through the snow. Alice and Ella and Peter, and the baby in the bright calico dress they call Dolly Varden. Uncle Peter teasing the children about switches in their stockings, the cabin filling up, the cold pushed back to the corners. And in the kitchen, 2 women working side by side, Ma and Aunt Eliza, Caroline and Eliza, the Quiner sisters making a holiday for a house full of children. You met her there once, for about 4 minutes, a warm, round, kind woman at a Christmas table helping in the kitchen, and then gone back out into the snow. Read it again now, because now you know that the 2 women in that kitchen were the daughters of a man at the bottom of Lake Michigan, drowned off a schooner when they were small, no body, no grave, no goodbye. Now you know that they had both, by then, buried their brother Joseph, the steady one, the oldest, the wall in a war hospital in Tennessee, dead of the wounds he took at the hornet's nest. Now you know that one of them, Eliza, had a daughter whose birthday she could never separate from that death, because the first day of the child's life, and the last day of the brothers were the same square on the same calendar. Now you know that the warmth in that kitchen was sitting directly on top of the two worst things that ever happened to that family, and that the women cooking the dinner were carrying all of it, silently, while a 4-year-old watched and felt only the warmth. The warmth was real. That is what you could not have known at the start, and what you cannot unknow now. The kindness was real. The Christmas happened. Eliza really did laugh in that room. None of it was a lie. It was just the top inch of a very deep thing, and the books gave you the top inch and called it the whole. And then the wagon drove off into the snow, and the book stayed in the warm cabin, and Eliza drove out of the American memory into 30 more years of moving. A flood that took her one real home, a husband buried in Minnesota, an old age spent as a guest in her children's houses, all the way across the country, to dry ground in California where no one comes to visit. While her sister, who carried the exact same losses, became Mars-sainted, immortal, a grave full of flowers for the single reason that her sister had a daughter who wrote, and Eliza did not. One Christmas in the book, a whole life out of it. That is the trade the gentle version always makes. It keeps the warm chapter, and it loses the woman. It keeps the holiday, and it buries the funeral. It gives you Aunt Eliza laughing in the kitchen, and it takes away the letter, and the lake, and the brother, and the date, the terrible, true, unbearable date, and it hands you a childhood instead of a life, because a childhood is easier to love. I am not asking you to love the warm chapter less. I am asking you to see the woman in it, the real one. Eliza Ann Quiner Ingalls, born 1842 to a drowned man, mother on the day her brother died, warm at a Christmas, a child made famous, and buried in 1,931 inches, a California town 2,000 miles from anyone who would ever know what she carried. She was not background. She was not furniture. She was not 4 minutes of someone else's memory. She was a whole human being who held more than the book ever told you, and held it the way most people hold the worst things quietly, between the chores, in the warm room where the children could not see. The next time you read that Christmas chapter, and I hope you do, because it is lovely, and the truth does not ruin it. The truth makes it almost too much to bear look past Laura. Look past the cousins and the candle smoke and the small girl's joy. Look at the 2 women at the stove. One of them got a grave the whole world visits. The other one wrote a letter about a pretty baby and some wheat heading out in a field, on the worst spring of her life, and handed it to her husband to finish because the baby wanted holding. That letter is almost all that is left of her. It was enough to find her by. It is enough to remember her by. And it is the last thing she would ever have guessed would outlive the snow.